or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the July 14th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Thank you for joining us today. Today is also a commemoration of Bastille Day, which occurred in 1789. Now for the key articles under the Business and Finance section. A coalition of 12 states, led by California, is suing to block Paramount's $81 billion acquisition of Warner Brothers Discovery, presenting the biggest obstacle for the deal. Volkswagen said it might have to cut 50,000 more jobs in a renewed drive to bring cost into line with those of other big car makers. Gold is down about 25% from its record high in January, including a 2.6% slide on Monday. The Nasdaq fell about 1.6%, the Dow declined 0.3%, and the S&P 500 lost 0.8%. Intel said it plans to invest $5.71 billion to expand its manufacturing site in Ireland, part of the country's latest effort to meet growing demand for AI and high-performance chips. Shane has cleared a key hurdle for its long-awaited Hong Kong IPO, winning China's nod for a listing that could see it valued at more than $40 billion. Lawson Whiting, the CEO of Brown-Forman, is planning to step down as the Jack Daniels maker seeks to move past a slowdown in alcohol sales. Meta has scaled up the size of its massive data center project in northeast Louisiana to 5 gigawatts of compute capacity and said it would now cost more than $50 billion. The United Arab Emirates boosted crude output by 80% in June from the previous month after quitting OPEC to escape production quotas and bring oil to the market on its own terms. Now for the highlights under the worldwide section. President Trump said he is reimposing the U.S. blockade on Iranian shipping, escalating a standoff over control of the Strait of Hormuz, and the U.S. launched a third consecutive night of strikes on Iran. Tit-for-tat attacks between Yemen and Saudi Arabia threaten to scuttle a truce and expand the war in the Middle East. Trump and his family acted in bad faith in bringing a $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS. A federal judge ruled in a rebuke of the president, his attorneys, and the DOJ. The Trump administration is pushing to limit undocumented immigrants' access to the U.S. banking system, requiring banks to consider loans to them as potentially risky. A federal immigration officer fatally shot one person during an enforcement operation in Biddleford, Maine, authorities said. A federal appeals court revived more than 500 lawsuits that allege Tylenol and generic acetaminophen can cause ADHD or autism if taken during pregnancy. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster named Darlene Graham, the sister of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, to serve as an interim replacement in the Senate. European authorities imposed sanctions on Russian intelligence units and hackers, accusing them of a 15-year campaign targeting governments and critical infrastructure across the continent. Died Sam Neill, 78, star of Jurassic Park. The picture on today's front page takes place at night, where many emergency people are pushing stretchers toward multiple ambulances. And that caption reads, "Tragic aftermath. Bodies are removed Monday from the Rang Bir Nat Lat Pro bar in Bangkok, where at least 27 people died in a fire. Most of the victims were found in windowless bathrooms where they might have sought shelter from flames." And that headline, "Thailand seeks answers in deadly bar fire." Other articles from the front page follow. Trump says he is reimposing U.S. blockade on Iran shipping. Oil prices leap as Pentagon starts new strikes. President talks of Hormuz tolls. By Benoit Falcon, Rebecca Feng, and Jared Malzahn. President Trump said he is reimposing the U.S. blockade on Iranian shipping, escalating a standoff over control of the strategic Strait of Hormuz. His comments on Monday came after the U.S. launched additional strikes against Iran, which defied U.S. demands that it publicly declare the strait open and instead closed the waterway. Oil prices jumped, with Brent crude trading 9.6% higher. The U.S. on Monday launched its third consecutive night of strikes on Iran. U.S. Central Command said the latest round began at 4:45 p.m. Eastern Time to continue imposing a heavy cost on Iranian forces and degrade their ability to attack innocent civilians and commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Trump told conservative radio host Hugh Hewitt that the U.S. was going to hit Iran very hard Monday and Tuesday, and there's not a damn thing they can do about it. Speaking shortly before Monday's attacks began, Trump said the U.S. would strike Pickaxe Mountain, a fortified underground nuclear site yet to be targeted since the war began February 28th. Trump asserted that the strait remains open under U.S. protection and said the U.S. would charge 20% of every cargo shipment as compensation for its cost. He didn't detail how that would work, but said procedures would be formulated immediately. "I want to be reimbursed because we're protecting a very rich portion of the world," Trump said. U.S. Central Command said U.S. forces would resume the blockade of Iranian ports at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday. 2 United Arab Emirates tankers were struck by Iranian cruise missiles in the Strait of Hormuz in Omani territorial waters, the UAE said. A crew member was killed and 8 wounded, the country's defense ministry said. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said it targeted and disabled the UAE tankers after the vessels ignored repeated warnings. Bahrain issued warnings for residents to seek safety without saying what triggered those warnings. Iran said it struck several targets in Bahrain. Earlier, Iran's armed forces said, "We will under no circumstances allow the United States to interfere in the management of the Strait of Hormuz." On Monday, the White House sent a letter dated Friday to Congress saying it had resumed hostilities with Iran on July 7th, restarting a 60-day clock where the U.S. can go to war with Iran without lawmakers' approval. The latest back-and-forth strikes started after Iran fired on ships last week to stop traffic using a U.S.-backed route through the strait. U.S. officials say their attacks both punished Tehran for targeting ships in the strait and pressure the regime to go back to the negotiating table. Few believe Trump seeks a return to all-out war, the officials said. Trump's announcement that the U.S. would collect payments contradicts what top officials in his administration have been saying for weeks about the legality of charging tolls to transit the waterway. It's an international waterway. No country is allowed to charge tolls or fees on an international waterway, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on June 23rd. That's existing international law. Some analysts said taking over Hormuz militarily would require a substantial ground invasion or a risky naval operation. Trump, a Republican, has decided against that route, which risks high U.S. casualties. States sue to block Paramount purchase of Warner. Attorneys general say pact risks harm to consumers in biggest challenge to the deal. By Joe Flint. A coalition of 12 states led by California is suing to block Paramount's $81 billion acquisition of Warner Brothers Discovery, presenting the biggest obstacle for a deal that will combine two of Hollywood's biggest producers and distributors of entertainment and news content. The unlawful merger of these two entertainment behemoths would lead to higher prices, lower quality, and less content for film and television, harming movie theaters, basic cable distributors, and ultimately audiences on every sofa and movie theater seat in the U.S., California Attorney General Rob Bonta said. The suit was filed Monday in federal court in the Northern District of California. Other states involved in the suit are New York, Colorado, New Mexico, New Jersey, Connecticut, Nevada, Arizona, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington. The states assert that the Trump administration has a record of not taking antitrust issues seriously. Banta, citing Ticketmaster, and the Next Star Media Group Tegna merger, said they are not just missing in action, they are making things worse. The coalition has requested Paramount and Warner not close the merger until after this process concludes, or they will seek a temporary restraining order to attempt to stop the deal from moving forward. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Frequent oil draws tax strategic reserve by Benoit Muren. The U.S. is tapping into its national stocks of crude with abandon. The withdrawals are taking a toll on the strategic reserve system. Just in the past 4 years, the Biden and Trump administrations have ordered the largest releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve while seeking to damp down soaring oil prices, a total of 352 million barrels, or nearly half the capacity of the stocks. Now frequent drawdowns, wear and tear, and a lack of investments are straining the reserve, according to experts. The 60 Gulf Coast salt caverns that make up the stocks can't be drawn from or refilled at the rate at which they were designed, federal researchers found. Equipment failures have bedeviled the reserve's managers. At one point, a well broke and caused the loss of hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude. The upshot, President Trump or a future administration might not be able to rely on the massive oil buffer like others have in the past, even as the prolonged U.S.-Iran war all but ensures continued volatility in energy markets. It's a strategically important national asset, and I think that its management and supervision needs to be elevated to reflect that, said Clayton Siegel, a non-resident scholar in energy security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. U.S. strategic stockpiles could play a crucial role in the coming months as the conflict lingers. The current release of 172 million barrels, authorized by Trump in March, is expected to further stress the facilities. Stocks in the reserves have fallen to their lowest level since 1983. An Energy Department spokeswoman said the administration was managing the reserve responsibly and helping stabilize oil markets, protect Americans from supply disruptions, and strengthen energy security at home and abroad. Analysts said the U.S.'s ability to weather oil disruptions doesn't hinge on the caverns as much as it used to. The shale boom turned the U.S. into the world's largest crude producer, and the country's reliance on imports has plummeted. U.S. drillers are on track this year to produce some 14 million barrels of oil a day, compared with about 5 million barrels in 2008. Still, the Iran war has shown that the stockpiles remain a key lever administrations can pull to provide relief to global markets. The current release, coordinated with other member nations of the International Energy Agency, helped cap a rise in U.S. crude futures to $112.95 a barrel, even as 1/5 of the world's oil supply was disrupted at one point. Prices now hover near $78. But signs of distress are mounting. The stocks were established in 1975, and investments aren't keeping up with the aging infrastructure, experts said. Department of Energy officials recently told the Government Accountability Office that they are holding the reserve together with Band-Aids, and that it is uncertain how long they will hold, according to a GAO report published last month. Judge slams president on his suit against IRS by Richard Rubin and C. Ryan Barber. The judge said Trump's lawsuit was brought to manipulate the judicial process. President Trump and his family acted in bad faith in bringing a $10 billion lawsuit against the Internal Revenue Service. A federal judge ruled Monday in a scathing rebuke of the president, his attorneys, and the Justice Department. The lawsuit led to Trump's extraordinary agreement in May with his own administration, in which the U.S. moved to create a nearly $1.8 billion anti-weaponization fund, and the government promised to ease all pending tax audits of Trump, his family, and his businesses. The administration backed off the fund, which had earmarked money for Trump allies who claimed they were wrongly targeted by the government, amid pushback from lawmakers, including Republicans, concerned that it could be used to compensate Trump supporters who stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021. The no audit promise, however, has remained intact. This was an attempt to use the court to provide some legitimacy to an agreement to confer immunity to people and entities affiliated with the president, and to earmark billions of dollars from American taxpayers to redress grievances not defined in the law, wrote Judge Kathleen Williams. Her 56-page order excoriated the decision to file the lawsuit and the government's failure to respond to it, but didn't appear to alter the agreements between Trump and his administration, including the deal to end pending tax audits of him and his businesses. Those documents were never officially filed with the court in this case. Williams said in the ruling that Trump's lawsuit was brought not to vindicate any violation of rights, but rather to manipulate the judicial process to pursue benefits unavailable in litigation because the parties were not adverse. She said the Justice Department's actions in the case were untenable and that officials abdicated their responsibility to defend the U.S. government's interest. Lindsey Graham's final mission, saving Ukraine. The South Carolina lawmaker relished a last moment of political triumph. By Robbie Gramer, Vera Bergen-Gruen, and Yoko Kabata. A day before emergency responders arrived at Senator Lindsey Graham's Capitol Hill home on Saturday night, the South Carolina Republican made what would be his last public appearance, standing outside St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery in Kyiv. Graham, who had spent months pushing for sanctions legislation he and others believed would force Russia to finally end its 4-year assault on Ukraine, described the moment as a chance to marshal support from the U.S. and other global powers to finally end the conflict. Quote, "I've never been more optimistic than I am today," he said Friday after meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. "We have a magic moment in time here." Graham, who had a personal rapport with President Trump, spent his final days in the role of a U.S. power broker that had defined much of his career, meeting foreign leaders, pressing for hawkish U.S. foreign policy, and planning to make the rounds on Sunday morning TV news shows. When Graham landed Saturday in Washington, colleagues said he was tired but elated after a whirlwind of meetings in Europe and Ukraine. He had spent his 71st birthday on the road, buoyed by a NATO summit in Turkey where Trump praised the alliance and embraced Ukraine. Most important, a revised version of the Russian sanctions bill appeared to have finally clinched White House backing. "This is a big effing deal. We all did good," Graham told Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut. Hours later, Graham was pronounced dead, leaving the front page for other news within the paper. Flare-ups threatens Saudi-Yemen truce by Stephen Kalin and Salih al-Batati. Attacks between Yemen and Saudi Arabia threaten to scuttle a years-long truce, expand the war in the Middle East, and choke shipping through another key waterway, just as President Trump reimposes a blockade on Iran. Saudi Arabia said the Iran-backed Houthis fired ballistic missiles and drones at a civilian airport in the kingdom's southwestern city of Aba on Monday. The militant group earlier accused the Saudis of bombing its main international airport in the capital, Sana'a, to prevent the landing of a plane that was returning the Houthi delegation from the funeral of Iran's slain leader. The attacks marked the first major fighting since a 2022 truce between the Saudis and the Houthis, a détente that settled a 7-year conflict between northern Yemen, Tehran-aligned rulers, and several Arab countries. Mohammed Abdul Salam, the Houthis' chief negotiator and spokesman, said multiple Saudi airstrikes on the airport constituted a breach of the truce. The Saudis haven't claimed responsibility for the strikes on Sana'a. Since the Iran war began, the U.S. and its regional partners have kept a close eye on the Houthis, a U.S. designated terrorist group whose drone and missile attacks during the Gaza war all but halted traffic through the Red Sea and Suez Canal for the better part of 2 years. Trump launched an airstrike campaign against the Houthis last year, which ended after nearly 2 months in a simple ceasefire, leaving the Houthis battered but not broken. While the Houthis have mostly held their fire since February, they still have the capacity to squeeze the global economy. The risk is even more acute now that Saudi Arabia is shipping much of its oil to the world via a Red Sea port to avoid the Strait of Hormuz. That path takes ships past hundreds of miles of Houthi-controlled coastline, leading to another choke point at Bab el-Mandeb, the strait that links the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the rest of the world. Saudi Arabia intervened militarily against the Houthis a decade ago after the rebel group took over Sana'a and large swaths of territory during Yemen's civil war. After the Iran war began, Saudi officials worked to maintain diplomacy with the Houthis to keep them out of the fight. The U.S. and Israel, meanwhile, sought to avoid any provocation that would draw the Houthis in and add another layer of complexity to the conflict. Those efforts may now be reaching the end of their rope. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, Iran kills deal, Trump revives blockade. Let's hope the president realizes the MOU Iran signed was a fraud. The blockade of Iran is returning, and the U.S. is taking responsibility for the Strait of Hormuz, President Trump said Monday. Could the late Lindsey Graham, proven right again about Iran's regime, be on the president's mind? We sure hope so. The question is whether Mr. Trump will stick to this new, old strategy of pressure on the regime, or after a short time again look for the off-ramp of futile negotiations. The Hormuz Strait is open and will remain open with or without Iran. We are reinstating the Iranian blockade, so named because it is only stopping Iran's ships or customers from entering or leaving, Mr. Trump said on Truth Social. U.S. Central Command said the blockade, which had been enforced before June's Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, with Iran, will resume Tuesday afternoon. The U.S. will be, from this point forward, known as the guardian of the Hormuz Strait, Mr. Trump added, but as such, and as a matter of fairness, will be reimbursed at the rate of 20% on all cargo shipped. Bracket that last part for now, as no one knows how serious Mr. Trump is about a $15 a barrel toll on oil exiting the strait. It's a bad idea, but the impulse that the U.S. should be compensated for doing what only it can in defense of Hormuz and the global economy isn't crazy. Better ways can be found for the wealthy Gulf countries and Asian buyers of Gulf oil and gas to chip in. Most important is Mr. Trump's commitment to the strait. After ducking the matter in wartime and then trying to solve it via diplomacy only for Iran to renege, the president now declares U.S. guardianship. This was always required to finish the job, as he lately describes his goal. Even as Iran struck a commercial ship, fired on U.S. forces and allies, and declared the strait closed over the weekend, the U.S. helped more vessels transit Hormuz successfully. U.S. retaliatory strikes have focused on degrading Iran's ability to block traffic, and CENTCOM's Admiral Brad Cooper has a plan to do much more. We have not deployed all the capabilities that we have to open the strait, retired General Frank McKenzie, the former CENTCOM chief, said Sunday on CBS's Face the Nation. It would require putting warships up into narrow waters. The U.S. Navy doesn't love to do that, but they're very good at it. His assessment: we certainly have the capability to control the Strait of Hormuz if the president chooses to follow that course of action. That, combined with a U.S. blockade estimated to cost Iran $435 million in economic activity a day, will squeeze the regime. The ceasefire that let Iran block the world's oil while its own was allowed to flow can, with persistence and skill, be turned on its head. The U.S. can block Iran's oil while the regime may be unable to stop the flow of anyone else's. Iran's regime may plead anew for talks as the pressure builds, but it has shown again that it can't be trusted. On Friday, senior U.S. officials briefed reporters that the next few days would be a test. Would the regime declare an end to all attacks in the Strait, as the MOU requires? Iran answered with more missiles and drones. It failed the test. With the MOU, Mr. Trump gave the regime a reprieve, and as usual, it perceived U.S. weakness and sought to exploit it. Iran trashed the ceasefire, and despite U.S. efforts to save it, the deal is now in tatters. Giving up leverage with the MOU didn't work, and we hope Mr. Trump also has tossed that in the bin of broken Iranian promises. If the Iranians want to talk about their nuclear weapons program, let them negotiate under the U.S. blockade as their main revenue source dries up. Like the nuclear program before it, the Strait was supposed to become the core of Iran's leverage to bully the world and the linchpin of its post-war deterrence. But now the regime invites more economic punishment and U.S. airstrikes merely to hang on to its imagined right to fire on commercial shipping. The U.S. response should be to make the Strait an albatross for the regime and its Revolutionary Guard. Last week, Mr. Trump told the truth about Iran's lying regime. Now let him act on it and stick to the strategy. Medicaid spending keeps soaring. Say this for the socialists running for Congress: they have an ambitious policy agenda. Republicans, on the other hand, appear to lack ideas and the political will for reform. As they fiddle, entitlement spending continues to soar, as evidenced by the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, latest monthly budget review. The CBO report for June shows that the deficit for the first 9 months of this fiscal year is $35 billion greater than during the same period last year. That's despite a healthy increase in individual and payroll tax collections, $169 billion or 5%, and custom duties from tariffs, $55 billion or 51%. Yet entitlements are growing even faster, swamping reductions in discretionary spending. Outlays fell for the Education Department, $55 billion, the Environmental Protection Agency, $20 billion, and Commerce Department, $10 billion, partly as a result of Biden-era spending ebbing. Yet these declines were swamped by higher outlays on Social Security, $62 billion, Medicare, $58 billion or 8%, Medicaid, $49 billion or 10%, and the Department of Veteran Affairs, $26 billion, or 9%. Net interest payments also increased by $98 billion, 13%, owing to the growing federal debt and higher interest rates. Last year's GOP tax bill made modest changes to Medicaid, such as imposing work requirements for able-bodied recipients covered by Obamacare and restricting a scheme that states use to launder more federal funds. Democrats accuse Republicans of gutting Medicaid, yet spending is still growing faster than almost any other program. Some reforms haven't taken effect, but the bigger problem is that the feds pick up 90% of the tab for the Obamacare expansion population. This is an inducement for states to spend more on these able-bodied beneficiaries. One way to reduce this perverse incentive is to set the federal matching rate for Obamacare enrollees equal to traditional Medicaids. As for Medicare, Republicans could make privately managed Advantage plans the default. These plans do a better job of limiting wasteful and abusive spending. See rampant abuse and fraud in fee-for-service hospice care, and are popular among lower and middle income seniors because they offer more benefits at lower costs than traditional Medicare. Republicans burned their second budget reconciliation on appropriating money for immigration enforcement after Democrats refused to do so. But if they want to keep their majority, they need to show voters that they want to do something useful if they win. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the opinion pages, Schumer's tragedy and ours. Jewish Democrats have found their loyalty to the party isn't being returned. By William McGurn. Chuck Schumer became the first Jewish Senate Majority Leader in 2021. Democrats lost their majority in 2024, but Mr. Schumer, as Minority Leader, is still the highest-ranking Jew in U.S. elective office. But increasingly, his greatest triumph is starting to look like his greatest tragedy. Not because he changed, because his party did. Following World War II, Jews were a mainstay of the Democratic Party, especially in New York, the largest Jewish city in the world. But in the past 10 years, anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli sentiments has exploded in American politics. It's grown in both parties, but it has grown more virulent in the Democratic Party, even as Mr. Schumer was advancing to the top. While the right has its share of anti-Israel voices, they tend to be outside the GOP. The anti-Israel elements in Mr. Schumer's party aren't limited to podcasters like Candace Owens or marginal politicians like Representative Thomas Massie, a GOP gadfly who was unseated in a May primary. In Mr. Massie's concession statement, he explained his loss this way: "I would have come out sooner, but I had to call my opponent and concede, and it took a while to find Ed Gallrein in Tel Aviv." Ari Fleischer, former White House press secretary for George W. Bush, conceded to Politico last year that Republicans have an anti Semitism problem, which he likened to a cold. Democrats, he said, have a fever. Democrats will rue the day they turn their back on Israel, says Mr. Fleischer today. From a moral and political point of view, this is going to hurt them. Think of the last month alone. In New York, Representative Dan Goldman lost the Democratic primary to Brad Lander, a Jewish Democrat who is backed by Israel antagonist Mayor Zoran Mandani and has accused Israel of genocide and endorsed anti-Israel Michigan Senate candidate Abdul El-Sayed. Mr. Goldman was famously banned by a Brooklyn coffee shop, which denounced him as a genocide enabler. Translation, he doesn't hate Israel. Another progressive Jewish Democrat, California State Senator Scott Wiener, was humiliated when he was chased out of the Trans March in San Francisco by a mob accusing him of supporting genocide. During a January debate of candidates hoping to fill Nancy Pelosi's set, Mr. Wiener fudged the issue. After that provoked a backlash, Mr. Wiener released a video declaring his submission. For those of you who saw the debate clip from last week, I want to clarify that I do believe Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. To me, the Israeli government has tried to destroy Gaza and to push Palestinians out, and that qualifies as genocide. Can anyone pull the Democratic Party out of this moral quagmire? What we are seeing isn't good for the Democrats or America. There were hopes that Rahm Emanuel might seize the moment. Mr. Emanuel is a former chief of staff for the Obama White House, who later served as ambassador to Japan and mayor of Chicago. Mr. Emanuel does not shy from fights. So what does he do at a moment when hatred of Israel is at a fever pitch? He flies to Israel to give a speech critical of wartime Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This ought to be Mr. Schumer's moment. Why is he not calling his party back to its history? It was a Democratic president, Harry S. Truman, who made America the first nation to recognize the new state of Israel in 1948. Jews and Democrats share an honorable history from FDR's New Deal to civil rights. Senator Henry Scoop Jackson backed crucial resupply efforts during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. American Jews and their liberalism were right at home in the Democratic Party. But hating Israel now trumps progressivism, including for many Jews. A recent Associated Press poll reports that 44% of American Jews hold a favorable opinion of Mr. Mandani. Only 39% of U.S. Jews view Mr. Netanyahu favorably. Today's party is nothing like the one Mr. Schumer grew up in. Those who regard Israel as a genocidal enemy are ascendant. And though the first Jewish Senate minority leader may cast individual pro-Israel votes, he certainly isn't leading in Congress on Jewish or Israeli issues. His position is like that of a young babysitter in the 1979 horror film When a Stranger Calls. After a series of disturbing phone calls, she calls the police. They get back to her with this chilling message: the calls are coming from inside the house. Same for Chuck Schumer. The Irrepressible U.S.-Iran Conflict by Walter Russell Mead. Only one thing was falling apart faster last week than Graham Platner's Senate campaign: the Memorandum of Understanding between the Trump administration and what remains of Iran's civilian government. By Monday, there was, as Gertrude Stein would put it, no there there. The Iranians have no plans to negotiate an end to their nuclear program. The Americans aren't giving Iran sanctions relief. Iran is firing missiles at commercial ships. The U.S. is retaliating against targets across Iran. Iran responds by targeting countries ranging from Oman to Jordan. President Trump calls the Iranian leaders evil people and scum before reinstating the American blockade. Mosques all over Iran echo with calls for the assassination of Mr. Trump. This isn't peace. It isn't even a ceasefire. What we have instead was described in one of the most famous lines in 250 years of American diplomatic correspondence. It would be superfluous in me, Abraham Lincoln's emissary, Charles Francis Adams, wrote to the British Foreign Secretary, to point out to your lordship that this is war. The core problem is that the conflict between the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran is of the kind that Adams' boss, Secretary of State William Seward, once famously characterized as irrepressible. Iran wants to control the energy resources of the Persian Gulf, and there is no local coalition of states powerful enough to block it without American support. The U.S. has believed for 80 years that ensuring the free passage of Middle Eastern oil and gas to world markets is essential to America's prosperity and security. Mr. Trump, a man for whom energy dominance is a central foreign policy theme, is unwilling to give Iran control of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran may make temporary concessions under grave duress, but it will not, perhaps cannot, abandon the drive for control. Both sides seem to see more reasons to keep fighting than to throw in the towel. On the Iranian side, the ability to block commerce, even partially, through the strait comes after a horrific series of humiliations and failures. Hamas's reliance on Iranian support turned out to be a vain hope. Hezbollah is on the back foot. Iranian influence is under threat in Iraq. The Houthis, until recently, were holding back from the latest round of fighting, and Iran's armed forces couldn't prevent the destruction of most of its conventional military power, as well as of its civilian leadership and supreme leader. Iran's attacks on its Gulf neighbors and on neutral shipping have restored the self-confidence of the country's hardliners. The destruction of civilian leadership has empowered the most radical factions of the regime, and the resilience of the regime's militias and clerical support amid failure and destruction have bolstered the hardliners' conviction that they can keep power indefinitely against renewed American attacks. Finally, we shouldn't underestimate the sense of joy and vindication that a global wave of anti Zionism and Jew hatred have given to the darkened hearts and minds of Iran's current leadership. Their resistance and defiance, they and their proxies in Lebanon and beyond believe is turning the global tide against the hated Zionist entity. They expect America will soon turn against Israel and the holiest of holy wars can finally begin. They conclude that Mr. Trump, worried about his falling poll numbers and the coming midterms, pressured by the Tucker Carlson wing of the Republican Party, won't dare attack Iran in full force. Mr. Trump, for his part, may be feeling more confident and less risk averse than the Iranian leaders believe. Iran's assassination threats are more likely to enrage than to cow him. With Russia weakened by its inability to end the war in Ukraine, and China facing economic worries and eager for a thaw with the U.S., Iran's fellow revisionists haven't exactly been rushing to its aid. Iran's attacks on its neighbors have deepened their hatred of its regime. Iran's effort to pressure the U.S. by firing at neutral and even friendly ships in the Persian Gulf tends to isolate the mullahs. Mr. Trump will likely find it easier to build support abroad and at home for a war to protect oil supplies by stopping Iran's blocking of the strait than he did for a preventive war against its nuclear program. War is almost always a succession of surprises, many unpleasant. This is especially true when unconventional leaders engage in an irrepressible conflict. Diplomats and investors should be warned. Both Mr. Trump and the Iranian regime may be taking their cues from John Paul Jones' response when asked if he was ready to surrender. Sir, he supposedly declared, I have not yet begun to fight. The Pepper and Salt cartoon shows a boss and a worker walking alongside the beginning of a new building being constructed. And the boss says, we will build it, but we have no idea what to do with it afterwards. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 14th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day, and please stay cool.
You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Volunteer radio readers broadcast daily readings, 24 hours a day, of newspapers, magazines, books, and other printed matter to area people who are blind or have a print disability, who are provided reading